Topic 4.2, and it's time to look at bond yields. Yields is another word for interest rates in a sense, but when we're dealing with bonds, a lot of people do use the words yield and interest rates interchangeably, but technically these are yields, not interest rates. Okay, an interest rate is a fixed percentage that is paid on, say, a loan. These are yields in the sense that what is fixed is the coupon, not the interest rate. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It's not overly important, but it is just one thing to perhaps pay a little bit of attention to as we go through. So there are two ways, there's actually more than two, but we're considering two ways of calculating the yield or the interest rate on a bond. Now, I've been a little bit loose there. I've just explained that a yield is technically not the same as an interest rate. As long as you're aware of that, I'm perfectly okay with you and me using the word, the terms yield and interest rate interchangeably. Okay, so we're going to use those interchangeably, but just for your own benefit, your own knowledge, just understand that technically we're talking about a yield here, not an interest rate. It's just that out there in financial markets, so many people use the term interest rates on bonds, even though it's technically not an interest rate, that we'll do the same. So there's many ways of, or really four main ways of calculating the yield on a bond. We're just going to look at the current yield in this video and then the yield to maturity in the next video. So the formula for the current yield is just the yearly coupon payment divided by the price of a bond. So if we go back to the bond we were considering previously, it had a face value of $1 million and an annual coupon of $60,000. So that's what I've put in here. I've got $60,000 coupon divided by the $1 million face value of the bond. So it is 6%, a 6% simple current yield. This is the simplest way of measuring the yield of a bond. Now, the next thing we need to realize is that bond prices can go up and down. So once a bond has been issued for, say, $1 million, it has a life of, say, 3 years. That doesn't mean that the lender of the money, that is the buyer of the bond and the holder of the bond, they're all the same person. That doesn't mean that that person or that organization needs to hold that bond for 3 years. Just like anything else, they can sell it in a second-hand market, what we call the secondary bond market. Now, if there's a lot of demand for bonds at the time, then bond prices, through an increase in demand, may increase. So let's just imagine now everyone is chasing bonds, and we'll start exploring why people may start to increase their demand for bonds a little bit later in the topic. But if you've done the reading, you may already have insights into why there may be an increase in the demand for bonds. But let's just say that there is an increase in the demand for bonds. The demand curve for bonds shifts to the right, so bond prices increase. What then happens is bond prices increase in the secondary market from $1 million up to, say, 1.1 million. So we're still talking about those 3-year bonds, and we're talking about perhaps 3-year bonds that have 2 years to maturity. Okay, so obviously a 3-year bond that has 2 years to maturity is going to be selling for a different market price than a 3-year bond that has 1 year to maturity, for a whole range of different reasons that we don't need to get into. But let's keep it simple. We're now assuming we're dealing with a 3-year bond with 2 years to maturity, and the market price of those bonds has increased to 1.1 million. Now, the only way that a 6.6% yield could be maintained is if the coupon went up 10% as well, to 66,000. Then 66,000 divided by 1.1 million would deliver the same yield of 6%. But imagine that you are the person that has borrowed the money. So you have sold a $1 million bond. It's got a life of 3 years, and the lender of the money is now holding that bond, and the lender decides to sell it on to another investor. And the market price of that is 1.1 million. And then that new owner of the bond, remember, you are the borrower of the money. You've borrowed $1 million for 3 years. That new owner of the bond, who's just paid 1.1 for it, comes along to you and says, well, interest rates were 6%. I've just bought your bond for 1.1 million. I think it's only fair that you now start paying me a coupon payment of $66,000, not $60,000. What are you going to say to that person? Tough luck would be a very nice way of saying it. The thing is, the coupon was agreed in the original terms and conditions of the bond. So what was in the original terms and conditions was not the 6%, it was the $60,000 coupon payment. So the fact that someone else has purchased your bond and taken ownership of that loan, in a sense, means that person must agree with the terms and conditions of the original loan, that is, accept a $60,000 coupon payment. If they don't like that, don't buy the bond. So the coupon is fixed. Doesn't matter how many times the bond is then sold over its 3-year life, the new owner of the bond will only ever receive the $60,000 coupon payment, because the $60,000 is what was agreed upon. There was never an agreement to pay 6% on the market price of the bond. So in this case, the new owner of the bond, by paying $1.1 million for it, when they know they're only going to receive a coupon payment of $60,000 a year, the new owner of the bond is then accepting a lower yield of 5.45%. So what we get is this inverse relationship between bond prices and bond yields. When bond prices go up, bond yields go down. Now, this is very important because this is the way quantitative easing works. And quantitative easing, and the opposite of that, quantitative tightening, is a policy that has been implemented by central banks around the world in recent decades. And so for me to explain to you what quantitative easing is and how it works and how it affects the Australian economy, global economies, etc., you really do need to appreciate the inverse relationship between the yield on a bond and the price of the bond. And so this should become quite clear now why we talk about bond yields and not bond interest rates. Because as bond prices go up and down, this yield changes. So the yield on the bond is the coupon payment divided by the price of the bond in the market. And this bond price can move up and down. So when you're buying a bond, the yield you get is the coupon payment divided by the price of the bond. And day to day, these bond prices are going to fluctuate. And so every day, the yield on this bond will be different. It's just that the yield is expressed in terms of a percentage yield. And that's why it's sometimes easy to confuse this yield that you're getting from this ratio here with an interest rate. If these were interest rates, then you'd kind of be looking at the yield on the bond would be 6% of the market price of the bond. So if bond prices went up to, say, 1.1 million, then if it was 6% on that, if 6% was the interest rate, then the coupon would kind of go to 66,000, but that's not the way it works. An interest rate is a percentage return on so let's say the market value of an asset, whereas a yield is something completely different. So it's a subtle difference, but hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to you why these are called bond yields and not interest rates, even though we're going to use these terms interchangeably. Now, some of you may have heard about interest rates becoming negative recently. Now, yields, which are very similar to interest rates, yields on these bonds can become negative, but only if you measure the yield using the term to maturity measure. If you use the current yield measure, you'll never be able to be there will never be a situation where the yields on these bonds will actually be negative, because the only way you can get a negative current yield is if the coupon is negative. That would then give you a negative yield. But that makes no sense whatsoever. If this coupon was negative, that means the borrower, instead of paying interest, would be receiving interest from the lender. So the lender of the money would be handing over $1 million plus the coupon payments would flow from the lender to the borrower of the money. So in a sense, you'd be paying, as a lender, you would be paying someone to borrow your money. That's the only sense in which the coupon could possibly be negative. And that's a ridiculous situation. That's never going to occur when a lender is going to not only lend someone money, but pay them to lend the money. That's a ridiculous situation. So the coupon can't be negative. However, the yield to maturity measure is completely different. And when you measure the yield of a bond using this different yield to maturity measure of a bond yield, then it can be negative. And I'll explain how that is the case in the next video. So right down here, I've got the yield as measured by the current yield. So the current yield can never be negative, simply because this coupon payment can never be negative. So what I've got in the next slide before we get on to 4.3 is a little bit of a story there, which just supports what I was saying in this video today. So have a read through that. It should make quite a bit of sense to you. I've used the same numbers in this text as I did in these examples. So this text is just supporting the previous slide. The only thing that I've added here is that the price of, I'm assuming that the price of the bond increased from $1 million to 1.1 million because of the fears of a stock market correction, right in the middle of the slide there, which means money will move out of the stock market and into the bond market. And with money, with people selling their shares and taking that money and buying bonds, because bonds are safer than shares, that will increase the demand for bonds. It'll inject more loanable funds into the bond market. But in terms of the demand and supply of bonds, it will increase the demand for bonds. Because if you're worried about a stock market correction and you sell your shares and you take all of that money and move it into the bond market, the way you move it into the bond market is buying bonds. And so as you buy bonds, you are then lending your money into the bond market. But that act of moving money out of the stock market and into the bond market by buying bonds, that shifts the demand curve for bonds themselves to the right. And we'll see how that happens a little bit later on. But if you've done the reading, that would make sense to you. And so by money moving out of the stock market into the bond market, shifting the demand curve for bonds to the right, that's how we get the market price of these bonds increasing from the original face value of $1 million up to the new market price of $1.1 million. and then the yield drops as well. Okay, the only other thing that I've got here that is new is that all of this happens in the secondary market. So when bond prices go from 1 million to 1.1 million, that happens in the secondary market. And the secondary market plays what we call a price discovery role, or an interest rate discovery role, or a yield discovery role. It's all the same. So what I mean by that is, if we have bond prices rising from 1 million to 1.1 million, and that implies the yield drops to 5.45%, this is all happening in the secondary market. So it's the secondary bond market. That is the sale of a bond from one lender, the original lender, to a new lender. It's that market which is determining the yield on this type of bond. So if a new issuer of bonds, that is a new borrower, comes along and issues bonds in the primary market to borrow money, then the coupon that they will now offer will be $54,500 on a $1 million bond. So that sort of raises the question, well, if you are issuing new bonds, how do you know what coupon to offer? Well, the secondary market will tell you. You look at the secondary market and you'll see bonds with a face value of a coupon payment of $60,000 selling for 1.1 million. That implies a very simple coupon yield of 5.45%. So it's this interest rate that then tells you that if you want to issue new bonds into the primary market, you will have to pay a coupon of $54,500 on a $1 million bond, which gives you the same 5.45% yield as similar bonds selling in the secondary market. Okay, so hopefully all of that makes sense. What we're going to do next is look at the more complex yield to maturity measure of a bond yield. And we'll see how a bond yield can be actually negative, that is a negative interest rate, when you use the more complex yield to maturity measure of a bond yield.